I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Sias Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome to the show.
Mark. Today, we're going to be talking about building metaplots. So,
what is a metaplot,
to start
Linda?
off, let's talk about what a metaplot is. You can see a few different definitions of metaplot floating around. Some of them are really broad, talking about, a metaplot is like a shared cinematic universe, like, all of the Marvel movies. That's a metaplot. Or anything that brings together events, stories, or different pieces of media through a common thread. You can also see this in like a series of books having a metaplot, or a TV show having an overarching metaplot, or a season of a TV show having an overarching metaplot. And what we see in role-playing games tends to be a little more like the metaplots that are, as you might see them in a season of a TV show. Although there are some very important differences with RPG metaplots compared to fully scripted metaplots.
That's for sure. Most of the time you hear the word metaplot, it's in something that is fully scripted, by which I mean it doesn't necessarily have a script, but at the very least the author can just do what they want to do. And the worst that will happen is that you change like lead writers or have a large writer's room who don't portray your characters consistently or something like that. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a tabletop RPG, really for a metaplot, you have to come up with an idea that will arch over your campaign, even though the players are just doing whatever they want, potentially. Depending on how sandboxy it is, maybe literally doing whatever they want. Even in a railroad, the players are still having their own solutions and their own reactions to certain characters or events that could change what your metaplot would be. So I would say that if you want to take inspiration for your metaplots from TV, movies, books, things like that, you're going to want to be careful to take inspiration from the kinds of stories that feel like a tabletop RPG, in the sense where like plots are going on and getting foiled, but something is happening in the background regardless. I would say Young Justice is good for that. Just there's a team of people who have different abilities. They come in and wreck whatever whatever the current plan was in the main plots. And then the meta plot continues because the Light or whatever other villains have we're like, yes, well, they did stop that monster attack, but during that time we stole this from the Museum of Atlantis, which has already been stolen by the time they even got there.
Yeah.
So now we have the thing we need for our next part of our plan.
So you can think of a metaplot in that sense, kind of like, we've got the thread of the story, and the thread of the story has little beads along the way, which are the different touchstones into the metaplot. And those might be light touchstones into the metaplot, where it's like, at the end of this episode for a TV show, or like sometime during the session you find like a note or a letter or something that indicates that something is tied back to the larger story. Or it might be stories that center around that. So the kinds of things that anchor a metaplot together are going to be, in the most classic sense, it could be things like an opponent, so a villain or a villainous organization and their schemes and movements. It could be an organization that the PCs are working with and what's going on with that. It could be a broader conflict that's going on, like a war, or it could even be like a set of objectives or themes. So like if the PCs have a goal and they're saying, hey, we want to revitalize the this region that has been plagued by undead, and kick the undead out and figure out what's going on here. So you can have a lot of different things that are all tied together. And so something can tie into the metaplot to a greater or lesser degree. So you have a metaplot that's like, okay, this is a metaplot about the undead incursion. You could say, well, maybe any story that touches on undead is tied to that somewhat. But then you can also have ones that are really, that's like, oh yeah, that has a bit of undead, versus this one's like, okay, now we're like trying to figure out the source behind the curse that's on this town. So oftentimes with the metaplot, particularly in your RPGs, you're going to have times that are more focused on the metaplot, and then times that are less focused on the metaplot. Short little arcs work really well for metaplots, where you have like a few sessions that are super focused on figuring out one piece of that story and exploring it in more depth, then punctuated with other stories that can explore different themes. And this really helps with with situations where, like, let's say that your metaplot's like, oh man, our metaplot's really serious and heavy. Okay, now we have like a more lighthearted thing, or even like, you know, an extended period of downtime or some other thing like that to break up the story and to because especially because with players, since they're not always going to do like what you expect. That sort of string of beads analogy helps for me to think about, like, okay, yeah, well, in between the beads, they go off and do whatever they want, and then here's a thing that happens, and then they decide how to respond to it.
Basically, not everything has to be part of your meta plot. Even if you're just really good at inserting your meta plot so that it will go where you want, you can have just sort of episodes that, like a TV series, where some episodes don't push the meta plot and are just sort of a self-contained unit.
Yeah.
A capsule episode or a monster of the week situation. You can do things like that, just like Linda was saying. That will help you determine pacing. Watch any of our episodes about pacing and tension and things like that, for the idea that you can control those by having them go up and down, not just like constantly escalating without any release valves.
Yeah. And you can, and those interim stories work really well as release valves, because, you know, just in the same sense that over the course of one little part of the story, you're probably going to have your, you know, your introduction, your rising action, your climax, your falling action, and your resolution. You can also have that across your arcs and then across your entire meta plot. But having those little punctuated moments, so instead of being up, then down, it's like, okay, we're going to do some waves, but the waves are getting higher and higher overall.
Right. You want to always be escalating like in a movie, but that doesn't mean it's monotonically increasing.
Mm-hmm. So another thing about metaplots is that you don't have to have just one. Another story structure that can work really well is having sort of an A plot and a B plot, where you have two predominant metaplots that are going on at the same time. So maybe, you know, you have a group of PCs, and on the one hand, they are a group that is trying to they're a group that's trying to, like, I don't know, they're trying to go on a huge series of heists and amass a treasure hoard that's large enough to bribe a dragon. But at the same time, they're also trying to figure out what's been going on, because some of the places that they've been going to have been hit by, like, some other thief who has this particular calling card, and they're, like, trying to track them down at the same time. So you could have multiple metaplots going on at the same time that might intersect or be connected, or they might be entirely separate in a way to tell two different stories at the same time. A lot of times what you might see in, like, a later season of a TV show is one where it's like, okay, we're going to have, you know, maybe one metaplot has to do with this particular opponent or threat that's, like, slowly building, and then another one has a bit of a faster pace to it. So you have the one that might be the one that's going to be more in the prominence at the end of the season, and you've got the one that's more the thing they resolve near the beginning of the season. So you can do something like that, or you can have them working completely in parallel.
All right, well, so Linda, as the over-leshy of organized play and narrative, has seen many a metaplot and presided over like a huge number of them. So we have a question for you in your great wisdom of metaplots.
Don't.
That's from the chat. It says, "What's a good example of falling action?" Now, I trolled the chat and then put a link to a bottomless pit hazard,
oh my God.
Which caused everybody to laugh at it. But we would like an actual answer from you that was not a bottomless pit hazard. For an example of falling action used in a tabletop RPG.
Yeah, I find that a lot of times in published adventures, falling action is something that can tend to get a little bit of the short end of the stick, because things can sometimes go more quickly from sort of the climax to the conclusion, because you don't necessarily have as much space. But that's something that works well for the GM to build out some more. And falling action being sort of that period between, like, okay, you know what, you've gotten this, you've pulled this together, but now we're sort of figuring out where we're heading toward the resolution. We're not quite at the end, but we're seeing how do these pieces come together. So, you know, maybe this might take place in the form of, like, some additional encounters or discussions and conversations and things like that help to resolve things. So yeah, you defeated the you defeated the main villain, but like now what are you going to do with the fact that there's now no ruler of this kingdom, and how are you going to figure that sort of thing out? So in a lot of cases in the falling action for a longer arc or campaign, this is a great place to bring the players in to talk about what it is that they see their characters doing. Because once you've defeated, like, I'm talking about for a whole story arc here. Once you've defeated like the big thing that you were trying to go for, then the players can be a lot more like, oh yeah, now that I'm done with this, I want to like figure out about setting up a wizard school, or I want to figure out about this kind of thing. If you're talking about it more in the sense of one that's not like at the very end of the campaign, but one that's more of an interim one,
like a pressure release,
then this can be a time where like you show that things are clearly getting better, and like, okay, this thing, we figure out, okay, how do we tie up those loose ends really to figure things out. The main threat is gone, but we have to figure out these other like little consequences and pieces. It can also be a time to start seeding in little bits for your next adventure, particularly if your one piece is going to flow right into the next one.
So when you were pointing out that adventures don't typically have a lot of falling action, it's actually true that published adventures. Yeah. But I think Western narrative in general underplays falling action as a component of your story and generally wraps things up in a bow more often. If you're looking at like a Kisho Tenketsu structure, which has 4 parts, falling action is kind of very tied into the Ketsu, the last part of that, and it's like a whole quarter of the structure is falling action, which is kind of cool, but unfortunately Western narrative is what the sort of Western narrative tropes and the myth of the birth of the hero and some of those other hero's journey, other things like that are so used in adventures and a lot of other stories that you're not often going to see it. I do think that like things like the Scouring of the Shire in Lord of the Rings, where it's like, we already won, why are we going back to the Shire and dealing with like these lower stakes situations, is one counterexample where there is like a little bit more of a falling action epilogue style portion of things, but
it's when I would say that's whatever you get between like, okay, we defeated the BBEG and all right, how it like these are the very final, like this is where we wound up in the end.
So there's 2 follow-up questions to that. First is, what do you think about recurring villains? Keeping them faceless kind of makes them impersonal, but they can't escape to fight again or whatever every time.
Yeah. I would say that anytime that a villain makes contact with the PCs, there has to be some chance that they get totally messed up. I definitely had my Council of Thieves group found a way to go and confront the villains sooner than they were supposed to. And they eventually decided to flee because they thought it was too dangerous, but I recognized that there was a possibility that they would push through and win. And then it would be like, okay, well, the campaign may end sooner than I thought, or we may need to pick up on other threads and see what would these other forces have done if these people weren't there to fill the vacuum. So once you put them on the screen, there's got to be a possibility that they get stopped, because if they are like, and they have this system that like they teleport away and there's like these 17 contingencies for it, like it can start to feel a little cheap to your players, especially if they do that a lot. A few ways you can do that: if the villain is actually like way higher level than the PCs, and they're not like someone who's set up in a way that the PCs are supposed to be fighting them, then that can assist. More usefully though, it usually is to have the PCs interacting not with the villain themselves directly, but interacting with people who work for that villain or assist that villain in some way. I mean, there's also like sort of the classic, I taunt you via a hologram or whatever type thing, or like writing letters, other ways to make the villain's presence known. Like, for example, people who are talking about the villain, or like letters from the villain, or like, let's say that the villain is like an important politician and the PCs can't just go assassinate them, or there's going to be a huge problem, but the politician is like making these decrees and causing these other problems. So you can interact with them in another way if there's like a really strong reason for the PCs not to just be able to go and gank them because they have resources that are beyond what the PCs can get to right away, and then they need to build resources.
Figure out what
get
your
to them.
villain's power source is.
Mhm.
If that source is appropriate for this, you might be able to have them face the villain directly. If it's political and they
Mhm.
can't just attack them, if their villain's power is that they puppeteer people through mind control, then they can talk through the mind controlled people or something like
Mhm.
that. But if they're just like a big ogre or something, and it's like my campaign villain is a big ogre, their
Mhm.
power source is smash with muscles.
Mhm.
You probably can't have that villain appear directly until the end. Also, like I may question whether that was a good idea for like a metaplot villain if that was like all that they had going to them. So
In that
you have
case,
to think about that.
I would see that more as like the the ogre army is the main villain that you're dealing with, and then you could have like, okay, well, that might have a bit of resilience in the sense it's like, oh well, you defeated this ogre who had been the one who was in charge of these things, but then another ogre rose up because you defeated that ogre before you defeated the majority of the army, and at some point like some part of it was able to go and regroup, but you were able to save like this city and the surrounding environment, but yeah, because the majority of the army was still out there, then this other thing happened.
That's right. And so the other follow-up question is, would a power vacuum be an example of falling action? I would say it would. Power vacuum at the end, figuring out how that vacuum is filled. Like one adventure path that does have that, at least that bit of falling action in it, it's not long, is Council of Thieves, where after everything is dealt with at the end, you have to figure out like how is that vacuum going to be filled in the city now, because like by that point, like the villains have lost, but also the mayor has run away, and just there's nothing. You have to figure out how the power vacuum is going to be filled, and that's sort of like what you figure out at the end of the adventure.
Yeah, and it can sort of be like the place where you establish, okay, probably whatever the PCs were doing was consequential to the world in some way, or at least the region. How is the world or region going to change after that, and what role do the PCs play in deciding what happens?
That's right. Just even having a little bit of an epilogue at least gives you something like that. Just like, I guess for the Indigo Isle adventure path, like Linda was writing the final section and had like, there was a very complicated piece of it, and she had like epilogues for like a whole bunch of different components depending on how things played in there, so that you would know that your action had consequences and that you made a difference.
Let's see. How would you design a meta plot for an evil party? What extra considerations do you need to make? I think it depends on what you mean by evil.
Yes.
If there's a big difference between, the evil party that's just like, oh, ha ha ha, we're gonna go around smashing angels because it's fun. And a party that's like, we are sort of the more chaotic evil type, and the more lawful evil type that's like, oh yeah, we are gonna be scheming, and we're trying to do these sorts. We're trying to like overthrow this, or we're trying to insinuate our way into this, or we're trying to achieve this other goal. I mean, I'm not sure if it's more about like the sort of good or neutral versus evil, or more of it's about like knowing what your players want and what they're trying to get out of the session. I guess like an evil party is probably more likely to be willing to explore the kinds of solutions that other parties might not be willing to. So they may have more ways to short circuit certain aspects of the plot if you're not used to working with that.
I think even the chaotic evil party that would murder anyone, including each other, and the moment you give them a plot hook, they murder the plot hook and then do something else, you can still have a meta plot. But you need to think about how you're building that meta plot and make it just a little bit more loose and chaotic, like the chaotic evil party. So here's what the meta plot can be. And it doesn't have to be more complicated than this. It doesn't have to be intricate. I mean, it probably can't be intricate for them. The meta plot can be that you're keeping track of their evil deeds, and you are raising some kind of, like, counter for yourself that raises the bounty that is on their heads and increases the level of, like, the degree of things that are chasing after them for their evil deeds. And they can check how they've been doing by, oh wow, the bounty on us has increased to 10,000 gold pieces, and now we're being attacked by these high paladins.
Yes.
And that could be the main meta plot, is just actually done in what seems like almost random encounters, but it's part of the meta plot of like this escalation of people coming after these evil characters who in the regular plot things, it's just like, oh, yo, there's a treasure-filled vault full of trolls? Yes, okay, we murder the granny and the orphans that were at the nearby granny orphanage and then make them into waffles. Did you say that that was something we could do? No, but that's okay because it still puts up our bounty.
Oh, I see here. The follow-up is evil parties seem more selfish and therefore less likely to work together long term. I'd say for a meta plot, it's important to have some incentive for each of the PCs to engage with that story. Whether, you know, the evil party may not have like for the goodness of our hearts, but if it's for, you know, if it's for money or glory or the thrill of battle or the potential ability to gain power and riches and schemes or things like that, those are all potential motivations.
And to back up a little bit, evil or good, whatever your players' characters are, when you're deciding what your meta plot should be, you're not an author, you're not a script writer, you're a GM. So you probably shouldn't just come up with all the meta plot first and then hold your session 0 or session -1. You should talk to your players, figure out what they want to do. It's especially important for an evil character, for an evil group, but it's important either way. That can help you build the meta plot. Just ask the evil player who's played the evil character what their evil character wants. It's like revenge. Is that their thing? They want to. They're evil and they do evil things, but their main goal is to get revenge on a powerful lord who kicked them out of being the heir to an area or something like that. Then you can add that into the meta plot that this evil lord is there so they can get revenge. And then, no matter how evil, selfish, and unpredictable they are, you at least know that that player is going to have their character pursue the revenge that literally they said was their evil goal.
Yeah, and if you're working with a published adventure, then things like the player's guides can be super useful to be like, hey players, here are some natural ways to bring your characters in, and they can help bridge that gap. But just like how, you know, if you're running a published campaign, you want to make sure that there's a reason for every character to have buy-in to the overall plot right from the beginning.
That's right. And in theory, published campaigns will have some degree of meta plot. In general, they have some, maybe not a lot. But that's because it makes it easier to run as sort of a published, you pick it up, you run it. Whereas your home campaign can have quite a bit more meta plot and resiliently, even though your players can do whatever they want, due to the fact that you are able to talk to them and sort of choose a meta plot that you have a good sense is not going to get foiled no matter what the players do. And like Linda said before, a big tip is do not put meta plot crucial things into a situation that the PCs are not supposed to foil or are not supposed to be able to defeat or get thing X, where it's like, since the PCs didn't get thing X, this happens next in the meta plot. It's like, assume that the PCs are going to, other than for things that were sort of like in the background and they did not interact with.
Yeah.
Like my aforementioned example of the museum losing a piece while the PCs were dealing with something else, and they weren't even in the museum.
And you might wind up with a pretty complicated tree of possibilities. There was a situation that needed to happen in Jewel of the Indigo Isles as per the outline that was pretty complicated to make sure that it actually happened. And I remember putting in like a giant sidebar that's like, okay, what if this most likely situation doesn't happen? Here's a sequence of events that still cause things to set back into a certain way and how everything responds.
It was like literally had 6 if-thens.
Yes.
For what to do if the PCs did not do a like very reasonable thing that most groups would just have done before any of the if-thens.
Yes.
Where it's just like, you know, you go to a thing and somebody asks you, hey, can you do this thing? And then you're like, no.
Yeah.
We're not. And then it's like, well, then this happens. Oh, we still don't. Then that happens. Then we still don't. Then this other thing happens. Well, we still don't. Then this happens. Oh, well, we still don't. Okay, well, then in that case, you get extra dialogue in one of these other scenes later where they say, I can't believe you actually did this, but, okay. And
Yep.
Linda took care of all of the possibilities.
Well, that's one of the things about Jewel is that it really takes the space to do more than typical published adventure would.
That's right. For normal published AP would just assume that you did the reasonable-ish thing, and then when like 20%, 10 to 20% of groups would just not do it, and it wouldn't even have the first if then. It would just be like, well, my group didn't do it. Then you go online and be like, what should I do? Because they definitely needed to have done this thing, or now the entire plot doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yep, definitely. But that's because of page space limitation, which is, for Indigo Isles, was not as big of a thing.
Thinking about organized play metaplots, those ones are a little bit different because unlike the metaplots in a story with a persistent group, and with organized play metaplots, you have to assume that the players may not be engaging with the whole entire thing. They might
Which
be
is sort of true for TV
Yeah.
series where people might catch only certain episodes. So you need to be a little careful there too.
So a few things to keep in mind for that. Mini arc structure where it's like, you know, one or maybe two sessions that tell an encapsulated story, as well as making sure that the pieces that you have that are part of the story that lean on each other are simple enough to be quickly and easily summarized. So that if somebody comes in and with TV shows, you sometimes see like they're previously on, and then that summarizes like the main things you need to know to understand.
Flashback episode.
Or like, you know, a flashback that appears as a part of an episode to remind people what's going on. Or like in a Pathfinder Society adventure, it might be like, okay, yeah, here's something that's part of the mission briefing where the adventure captain tells you, oh yeah, XYZ, this thing happened last time, and there's a stipulation for, oh, did you play that scenario? Then they say like, great job, you did this thing.
Last time on Pathfinder Society,
but
we did some dances.
But that honestly also applies for longer term campaigns too. Like, let's say that you have a campaign that you've been running over the course of several years, and like you've got a metaplot that's arching over that whole time. Your players aren't going to remember fine details from several years ago. So finding ways to put in reminders of those major points and to repeat the most important beats multiple times so that the players will keep picking that up.
Last time on Home Campaign several years ago.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know one of the practices that we found useful is to start sessions with having one of the players take point on summarizing what happened last time for the group. And this is useful not just for like everyone to, and if someone's like, oh yeah, didn't this thing also happen? Oh yeah, this thing happened. It's useful not just for the players who were there if it's like, oh, it's been 3 months since we played, what happened last session, but it's also useful if somebody missed the session for them to quickly get up to speed about what's going on.
Right. So while you could potentially be a Xanatos and set up a meta plot that is like has so many contingencies that you're guaranteed that it's going to go off pretty much in a way that you can predict, you also want to be careful with your metaplots. And even if you think that's true, be ready to adjust them every so often after the PCs do something unusual.
So it's usually stronger if instead of your metaplot being like, you know, this person goes here, does this, achieves this, succeeds at this, and does this thing, be like, you know, these people have these objectives and these resources. If the PCs don't do anything, then their likely result is this. If the PCs do kind of what I expect, their likely result is somewhere in this range, and the PCs might come up with some different thing. You know, if this villain fails, then what? You know, if the villain fails early, who else might come in to try to take things over? Do the PCs just win on that, and then they move on to another story?
Yep. I'll use the Atlantis Museum heist one more time. So it'd be like, we sent in sea monsters to attack Atlantis. Okay, if nobody stops us, the sea monsters destroy or take over Atlantis entirely, and we win. But we're assuming that you know, the PCs will come and stop these sea monsters, and during which we use that opportunity to have a Confederate who works for the museum just kind of smuggle out an artifact from the museum. So no matter what happens, something happens for the meta plot. It's even better for the bad guys if the PCs lose or just don't do anything.
And then you know what happens, but then they're PCs, so what if they found some way to catch the people who were also doing the heist at the same time? Well, then that's not going to stop the villain's entire plan, but it could give overarching plan. You're not going to, you wouldn't want to put like, this here there be the key that is absolutely essential for the meta plot. Like you don't want that to go like within a mile of the PCs.
Which, by the way, the museum thing could work. Mm-hmm. You could be sure of it if, like, the fight doesn't happen at the museum, the PCs are not within a mile of the museum. Yes. It's just in another part of the city where the PCs do not go. There are ways that you could be sure that the museum heist actually works. And if it's plot crucial that mm-hmm. museum heist needs to work, or, like, none of the rest of the meta plot will work, then you should literally let this advice and keep them a mile or at least some very large distance away.
Well, it makes me think of a session that we did in the Changeling / Mage game that Mark has been running, where we had the PCs were all going to a museum on a totally normal day, just hanging out with friends, and there were then suddenly, like, the alarm bells start going off, and there's a heist. But not just one heist. There's, like, 7 different heists all at the same time.
There's, like, 4 heists. Okay.
Vampire Group 1, Vampire Group 2, the like, evil techno wizards,
and the werewolves.
No, there's also the Nightmare Fairies.
Yeah, there were 5. I was closer with 4.
Nah. Anyway, so we had a bunch of villainous groups that all came in at the same time, and they all did a heist that was related to one of their schemes. And so, like, the overall plot of the campaign was going to be fine if any one of them got stopped, but there was no way we were going to be able to stop all of them.
That's true. You did stop a high percentage of them, but not all of them.
There was no way we were going to be able to stop all of them, and then which people got away with their powerful MacGuffins help indicate, like, who was going to advance their plan.
I think you almost stopped all but one.
Yeah, we almost stopped all but one.
But one of them got really lucky and escaped alive barely at the end.
Here's another one. My custom setting, same group for a decade plus. The campaign setting is basically all centered around a huge meta plot that every campaign plugs into. I feel like I have a hard time making each individual campaign its own special flavor without instantly connecting it to the core meta plot. Trying to create stories in the world instead of always making those stories about the world, if that makes sense. Thoughts? Yeah.
So yeah, that's really interesting. That's even bigger than a usual meta plot. That's like what is it called, a myth arc, where when it's like so big that it encapsulates multiple meta plots and entire, like, stories and seasons and things like that all into something.
Yeah. I would say that probably having sort of that A and B structure, except with, like, a larger A and a smaller B, for plots where you have, like, a little sprinkle of that central story that comes into play, and then every campaign has its own big arc of meta plot. So that way you still have that element in there, but it's more of a spice. Or you can have characters that are connected to that in some way about that without that being like their only primary thing. So, like, let's say for example that a major part of your setting is the fact that people who cast spells are tying into a corrupted source of magic, and then they, like, will gradually start, and this is going to gradually influence their behavior and cause them to try to start bringing about the end of the world or something like that. Then instead of having every plot be about, oh my gosh, all these people are trying to bring about the end of the world, then you might have, like, okay, well, there's this other stuff that's going on, and maybe some of these end-of-the-world people sometimes show up, and they're like, yes, well, we think that this scheme is going to help bring about the end of the world, so we are, like, a few of the encounters that you face in this area, but we're not, like, the only thing that you see, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what your specific core meta plot is here, but...
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
But finding ways to make it something that's little pieces of it that show up sometimes, but are like, I find that when you have, like, also, like, big dungeon areas, one of the classic things is you've got the big dungeon area because there's, like, the villain has got a broad tent of allies who are all working together toward the same goal, and they're coming from different perspectives. Having people who are associated with the that main meta plot be, like, one of many factions who are around. Lets them get some screen time while not having the majority of the screen time.
So while you were saying that, I was reading up a quick thing on the dangers of myth arcs, and a suggestion that I found on good old TV tropes is that if you know where you're going from the beginning, like Babylon 5, you're more likely to be able to resolve your myth arcs and not have them just kind of take over and keep going on forever like X-Files did. So that is at least a piece of advice from other media that had a giant myth arc that sort of
I guess another question there
through the entire everything.
Yeah. Another question there is this metaplot something that you are planning to resolve in one of your campaigns? Because if you resolve it, then that's tidied up. Whereas if the metaplot's more like this is something that is central and foundational to the theme and flavor of the setting, then
yeah, absolutely. So let's see.
That's a little different.
In terms of metaplots, we put out the definition of the metaplot. We talked about the most important things to keep in mind in terms of tips and tricks and techniques for running a metaplot successfully in tabletop RPGs, drawing upon our experience from GMing and of course your experience from just like being the developer or like team lead on so many adventures that had metaplots. Let's see. We answered, I think, all of the questions that people have asked in here. Did you have anything else that you wanted to say about metaplots, Linda?
I think we covered things pretty well.
All right. Awesome.
I just checked my notes. I did say the things I was planning to say.
Perfect. So in that case, everyone, let's say bye to YouTube, and we'll do our outro and talk about upcoming episodes. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye.